thank you. I'm very sorry I was late, but I just got caught in terrible traffic coming from my place. I should thank you, Srimurthy, for asking me to do this and meet up with a very dear old friend about everything else. I think we have something very interesting here. Over the last many years, a lot more research has come when both of us started out to be students in ancient Indian history, from where I moved in very different directions. But Aloka thankfully stayed on with the interest and has contributed in her very special way to enhancing our knowledge on a subject which is otherwise very, very specialized. And unfortunately what we find is there are not too many scholars who can look at ancient history, text and myth, etc. in very gender-sensitive ways. So Aloka, Parasher happens to be one of them, and I think one of the earliest to have begun with that focus. Because when we started out as students, there was no focus on gender. Really not. So I think we have something very interesting on that. The title. Some impact of God. The title, as is there before you, on the fragments in history, text, objects, and local history since early. I'd particularly like to welcome Professor Thapar, who initiated both of us into ancient Indian history way back in 1973.
Really nice to have you here this afternoon, and thank you very much, Ramna, for coming for this. But don't get very angry because it's like one of those lectures which is going to But I'm going to speak, as everybody knows, on the fragment in history, text, object, local history in early India. I've had a long engagement with looking at histories of small communities and regions which generally called peripheral, but in this talk I want to center the periphery. So I'll begin with a quotation of a more recent period, reflecting on a more recent period of Indian history, and give you a sense of what I want to do. And I'll quote, "We live so embedded in our history that its very visibility can make it difficult to acknowledge. Stand on any Indian street corner, urban or rural, home or diasporic, and signals from the past are everywhere. Architectural details, signs in food shops, designs floating in passing saris, broken fragments of conversation, they are the scattered ends of what brought us here," unquote. I'll reveal the author of this quote in the end of my lecture. In this lecture, I place before you two stories, taking us back to the early centuries of the Common Era. I deliberately choose the word story and not history. This is because in both the cases, I look at an object or image without a major text, and to talk about them, I must necessarily weave an account that seems to be stories since history has disowned them as mere fragments. Is it legitimate then to build stories around fragments in history and rethink how we do history? Embedded in our history, they emerge before us as signals and impressions floating before us, but since they are too scattered, we find it difficult to weave them into our meta-historical narrative. Just imagine one such fragment. She traveled alone, she traveled across the ocean. She also remained at home. She retained her inherent beauty. Alas, one does not know what she spoke, what she wrote, or what was meant to be her role. She does not have a name. Today we see her personified in one of two identical images that have been found. This is a very beautiful female ivory statuette. So if I can show that to you. From Pompeii, this is from Pompeii, found in Pompeii in the Italian peninsula. And her twin or almost identical images, one is found at Thebes and the other at Bokassa in Peninsular India. she has become part of what is today commonly called craft studies. And of course, in the ancient world, lots of such objects are studied under the category of craft studies. And as Ferrelo and Owen, who have written about this, say, and I quote, regardless of scale, form or function, their meaning is couched in a non-verbal language to be received and perceived tactfully and visually, unquote. And I would add to this to be written into history in terms of their own logic, rather than simply listed peripherally as part of a meta-narrative focusing on the dominant. I shall return to her story later in this presentation. But before that, I'd like to locate myself as to why I got into, was almost obsessed with studying such fragments. The idea of understanding and using the fragments in history caught my imagination when in the late 1990s, a friend of mine presented me with Anthony Crafton's book called The Footnote, A Curious History. So why did she do so? She used to be on this motorbike going through this very rough terrain of what is the heartland of Telangana, north of Hyderabad, looking for iron-related materials. Both of us were grappling with trying to understand small, scattered, often unrelated pieces of information from excavations at sites in areas that had hitherto been concerned backward in archaeological terms, as they had not thrown up monumental remains for the early historic period, as were found in plenty in the contiguous regions for the same period. With concerted effort, we seemed compelled to propel the unitary ideas of the scientific method we were trained in to explain the fragment. It was also a source of history, alibi of a different kind. A concern then became how do we reconcile our tools of interrogating the past with those inherent in the sources we use to write this history. And so turning to understand the theoretical import of a footnote became very imperative, and Crafton came in handy. And I quote Crafton now, like the high whine of the dentist's drill, the low rumble of the footnote on the historian's page reassures. The tedium it inflicts, the pain inflicted by the drill, is not random, but directed, part of the cost that the benefits of modern science and technology exact, unquote. The struggle over what history is and how it should be told is dependent on the footnote. This tool differentiates history as a mere narrative to one that is substantiated by evidence, and thus makes it, to quote, a true science purporting truth. Therefore, is critical to the scientific nature of historical writing, which reflects both the ideology and the technical practice of the craft. History, of course, is not an axiomatic science, and therefore there are historians amongst us who wage whole wars against other scholars through the medium of their footnotes. This long-standing animosity towards the footnote derives from the tradition that perceived of historical writing as a form of literature, and thus impacted the very understanding of history. But the role of the footnote as proof that historians have visited the appropriate archives, dusted off the necessary documents, and consulted and exhausted the secondary literature is with us here to stay. It in short has become a badge of legitimacy. Anthony Crafton's book thus raises the fundamental issue for discussion, namely, and I quote, footnotes to history give way to footnotes as history, unquote. And thus recounting for us the subtle ways, the curious history of the progress of knowledge through the footnotes is written. This is a complex story, and Crafton takes us through a very long journey of the status of history as an art, then as a science, and now as an institution. He writes primarily in the context of Western and European historiography to show the trajectory of how the footnote in history has been treated, and has convincingly argued that its value and position is embedded in the power and authority it gives to our respective tools of analysis. When we grasp these concerns on the Indian situation, the nature of the footnote must necessarily become a very important subject of concern. Thus, for instance, the textual past of early India and the reliability of such texts, often rooted in mythical beginnings, are treated as less amenable to truth and authenticity compared to the more recent official records, or the more hardcore information emanating out of a contemporary inscription or archaeological object. However, the power and burden of the intellectual discourse is something that historians of ancient India have found very difficult to escape from. Late into the 20th century, Richard Lariviere reminds us of the power of philology and how it can help us retrieve the voices of Indians of all social classes, despite glaring omissions that some of the so-called facts of early Indian history were never referred to in the ancient Indian literature. We are also supposed to locate all Indian literary sources belonging to different genres as footnotes, apparently free from the worldview that was inherent or impinged upon them. And the reason why I say this is that much of this literature that was then written down and becomes part of very authentic sources were actually orally transmitted and so on and so forth. We have to then use, you have to then use these footnotes and provide explanations for the past, the true reality of the past, committing us to a very complex relationship with these footnotes. We must remember, though, that most of the texts and inscriptions used in writing on ancient India, along with the archaeological data as footnotes, in fact, form only a very marginal part of the historian's text, serving as a reminder of the life as well as the precariousness of the historical text construction. Grafton highlights the perennial competition between demands of truth or erudition and those of history as narrative with a persuasive power of composition. Grafton's argument is clear, namely that there was a definite point in time when footnotes attained a level of sophistication that distinguished historical modernity from tradition. As evidence, the footnote is often mistaken to be only of technical use, providing a testimony to past reality. However, in the present context, the nature of the footnote, I emphasize this, that the nature of the footnote thus used hinges on the reality and the worldview that it is supposed to represent. Scholars often do not recognize that the dominant intellectual discourses in early India often looked at history rather differently than we do today, and Professor Thapar is here and she has just brought out this monumental book on the past before us. So this is my getting into the idea. I didn't get consciously into the fragment. I got into the fragment because I was fragments were thrown at you, and that you were trained in the larger meta-narrative built out of the ideological discourse and text and so on and so forth. So therefore, reading Grafton brought issues of how do we treat the footnote to the fore. The question before us today is the fragment. The fragment is also a source for very ancient periods of world history. They are seen as legitimate sources of information, primarily because of the scarcity of sources for these periods when it is used to supplement information from one kind of source for another. But this is a different kind of use of the fragment than what we want to suggest. For the present, I don't want to use the fragment only as supplementary. For the present purpose, we use the literal meaning of the word fragment to the hilt. As a noun, fragment means a part broken off or detached. Elaborated, one could use it in the sense, for instance, of the scattered remains of a broken vase or something like that. Example from the dictionary here. It could also be used as an isolated, unfinished or incomplete part, as in the case with an example which tells us, again from the dictionary, she played a fragment of her latest composition. And finally, it could be used as an odd piece, a bit, a scrap. We do not retrieve its meaning as a verb, which means, to quote, to break something into pieces or fragments, cause to disintegrate. This meaning would articulate its use as, again, from the dictionary, outside influences fragmented the Mayan culture, unquote. The latter use would highlight its negative connotation as a willful agency to divide things, create disunity, split into parts and so on, which is not our intention to highlight in order to bring the centrality of the fragment in history. We shall thus highlight examples of a fragment in the context of them. I've done several of these, so I'm just summarizing over here. I'll only share 2 examples with you. So I would like to highlight the fragment in the context of them being either a piece broken off or cut off from something else, or a piece representing an incomplete whole due to the fact that the whole is missing. the whole is missing from the sequential piece, or still further, it is considered a fragment when all its pieces are not present together to make it a whole, even though it is attached to a whole. I shall begin with an example of a fragment that first energized me to look afresh at its role in rethinking the way we construct ancient social identities that have a bearing on our interpretations of them in the present. Well into the 21st century, one of the most common ways in which society in early India is described is, and I quote, Indian social structure is made up of 4 stratified varnas. The system, including sub-varnas, formed during the ancient period. The most important characteristic is that the system has stubbornly survived to the present day, despite the fact that we do not notice it readily in everyday life, unquote. This quotation is from a 2005 comprehensive publication on ancient Indian social history by the Japanese scholar G. Yamazaki. His perspective emerges because of the repeatedness in the way in which the Dharma Shastra, the Artha Shastra, and to some extent also Buddhist texts describe Anuloma and Pratiloma jatis, as well as the way the caste system is presented. And he tends to give us a rationale why he would like to look at social history of early India in this way. And I again quote from him. He says, no historical works such as official chronicles were recorded, or if recorded were scattered and lost during the period in question, forcing us to turn to religious and theoretical sources as the only alternative, despite their obvious flaws, biases, and lack of uniformity in obtaining an idea about how ancient Indian society actually functioned, unquote. Beyond the use of conventional sources, Yamazaki's aim to study ancient Indian society was to approach reality by comparing the orthodox Brahmin view with the unorthodox Buddhist view. The idea that the Buddhist text depicts social reality has inherently been accepted as axiomatic in binary opposition to the Brahmanic Dharma Shastra's political view in his hypothesis. We, however, need to emphasize that both are views from literature. An alternative in our example comes from the scope provided by inscriptions and art historical material, wherein we suggest that one needs to go beyond the primary and interrogate a more shared space. So I did this exercise in 2007, and this book was published in 2005. In 2007, I wrote an article which was on travelers and names of travelers and inscriptions and so on. And in this I suggested that there was a shared social space provided by those moments and periods in history when social groups, individuals participated in a complex environment of ideological and economic transactions. However, the fragmentary inscriptional data that is central to the present analysis has been used only as corroboratory evidence. Fragmentary labeled inscriptions have provided us interesting names of people in varying contexts as travelers, preachers, traders, and so on. This data has been usually deciphered and kept aside since there is no connected narrative found to elaborate upon. However, we have argued at some length that it is this type of data found in regional and local contexts that throws up issues of diversity and agency that the textual traditions fail to provide us with. An important location where the diversity of proper names had emerged in large numbers was the early inscriptions at the Buddhist sites in regions immediately south of the India, namely the Deccan, dated roughly towards the 2nd century BCE to the 4th century CE. In an analysis of the way these names occur at various sites in this region, we noted that cutting across caste lines, many lay followers of the new faith as donors, as builders, as scribes, as a variety of craftsmen, as traders and merchants recorded their names. In the Western Deccan, amid several references to names of Sahabatis and Vanidas and Sethis, there were names of gardeners and garland makers and goldsmiths, ironmongers, ploughmen, who asserted their identity in terms of the place they hailed from. In the Eastern Deccan, however, the emphasis was more on kinship identity, which was apparent in the way in which these names occurred. It is from among these that I take an example from Amravati, where a craftsman who belongs to a leather worker's caste asserts his kinship identity thus. That is, this refers to a gift by one Vidhika, son of a teacher, Upjaha, Naga, the name of the teacher being Naga. He is the son of the teacher Naga, belonging to the generally understood ritually impure Charmakara Jati. He gave this gift of a slab with an overflowing Purna Ghata or auspicious words, along with his mother, his wife, his brothers, his sisters, his daughters, and other relatives and friends. Apart from having a proper name for a member of the outcast leather workers community for such an early period, this inscription points to the important question of these communities now taking to teaching within the confines of the new intellectual order provided by Buddhism. It was a Charmakara or leather worker called Vidhika, the son of a teacher called Naga, who gifted this slab with an auspicious spot of Purnagata, an act that denotes an agency to donate and participate in the normal activity of what other social groups at the same time were involved in. Clearly, this is a fragment in a locality deeply soaked in Buddhist ethos and symbols. Today, very few know that the symbol of the Purnagata has been accepted as an emblem that defines the letterhead of the official correspondence in the state government of Andhra Pradesh, where this Buddhist heritage site of Amravati is located. I learned that a replica of this Purnagata or auspicious spot is now being made by the tourism department of the government of Andhra Pradesh to highlight the significance of this historical artifact to a larger number of people and thereby create a greater scope to present a more inclusive history. The question, of course, is whether multiple histories can be authentic histories. Anthropologists and social historians have reported on the origin myths of Shudra and other so-called untouchable communities to explain their respective origin in rather positive ways, and therefore these differ totally from the grammatical vision of origin of these castes. Thus, the Shudra account, to quote, represents the Shudra servitude in the Varna system as unsanctioned, as based on a mythic historical fact of injustice and betrayal, unquote. And in a recent account of the untouchable here, Cobbler caste explains rather pragmatic circumstances that help us, to quote again, deny the family's low caste origin, ascribing its misfortune to British, in contrast to other myths that blame the Brahmins or gods for inventing the caste system, unquote. These oral narratives contradict the official documents and perspectives. In the present-day Indian context, the changing status of hitherto lower orders in society, we emphasize that historians break this impasse by emphasizing on fragments like the one that I have highlighted, and also information from a variety of other non-official sources, so that our footnotes now are revisited in other ways. Though they do not present before us a continuous narrative account of their existence, but they forcefully throw up before us data that tends to question the worldview of the dominant. The fragment provides an interpretative dimension that would enable us writing of the excluded so that we can emphasize, to quote, a culture of pluralism where multiple contradictory worlds coexist as central features of everyday life, unquote. Now I return to the second example of the historical evidence provided by a fragment, the anonymous traveller that I talked about, namely the ivory statue. This is an example that reflects on the way early Indian economic history had marginalized reference to cultural objects in terms of trade between India and the Mediterranean during the early centuries of the Common Era. On the one hand, the cultural historians have given detailed descriptions of the objects without discussing the larger place of such objects in the exchange and trade that was vibrant during this period. Apart from trade, this is the image from trade. Apart from trade, and there's another, this is a broken image from Bokardan, but as I will try and show you, the very enthusiastic excavator over there made line drawings of this image, and I will just come to that in a minute. So apart from trade and Bombay, another version of this fragment is this damaged form from Bokardan. A brief inscription in Kharoshti is found at this place. And the Indian excavator of this image, even though it was damaged, this was a damaged piece, wrote, and I quote, this was S.P. Dio and R.S. Gupte who excavated here. In the provoking sensuality, the extraordinary delicacy in the modeling of the warm, fleshy form, full form, The mellifluous rhythmic contours and freedom and elegance of pose, the central figure seems to outbeat the other ivories so far known from Pompeii and Thebes. This charming yet somewhat candid sensuality of the female form is typical of ancient Indian art. In this respect, this ivory stands on par with the rave figures of Mathura as well as the Yakshanis of Bharat and Sanchi, unquote. He further writes, while, I quote again, while describing the Pompeii ivory, J.H. Fogel had experienced the want of Indian ivories of an early date. Now Gopardhan has supplied from a stratified deposit a specimen prepared beautifully by an Indian Dantaghataka. The ivory would help us decide not only the date of the same statue, but also its indigenous character, unquote. So forceful is his claim that one is equally emphatically drawn to the period that it was produced in to further imagine that it must have been its aesthetic as well as its early belonging to the Indian indigenous soil that must have compelled the Roman/Italian merchant to buy it or acquire it. Her description from the perspective of scholars in classical studies, however, is different. It is more pragmatic in its tone and description. A recent book by Grant Parker has classified this ivory statuette under the subheading of craft objects, pertinently recognizing in the beginning itself that for this category of objects, I quote, the pickings are meager, unquote. We are now informed that it was found in 1938, not this one, but this one. It was found in 1938 and was housed in the National Museum in Naples, and it's just 24 centimeters. It's a very small item, and it is distinguished by very fine craftsmanship. It exudes a sense of composure, though the statue depicts a naked lady. Her head, neck, waist, arms are shown very clearly, richly adorned with traditional jewels. Both her arms are raised in a pattern that indicates that she is arranging her hair. Further on each side, she is flanked by smaller, childlike figures that may be considered her attendants, as they appear to be carrying items perhaps for her toilet. So this is the kind of description that we get from Grant Parker. Interestingly, there is a protrusion that appears on the left side of her head, which has become a key factor in deciding what purpose this artifact serves. Also, it has been used by scholars to identify her. Earlier scholars saw this as the handle of a mirror, but more recently it has been considered to be the leg of a small piece of furniture. So, from mirror to furniture. This is plausible. The latter, a lot of scholars now feel that the latter is more plausible, it better explains the fact that apparently it was intended to be viewed from three angles. If we take into account the two smaller figures and the vertical hole that extends from the top of her head to the waist. The earlier identification of the woman with Lakshmi, a goddess of good luck, fertility, prosperity, can be dismissed and be considered baseless because according to Wheeler, this is probably not the intention of this object. And that she emerges in this context, and I'll tell you the context where she is found in Pompeii, and that would also explain a little more about her. But that it was of Indian origin, there is no dispute, and that it's part of the statuary of the Shatavahana times, that's also not in dispute. Where was she found? I mean, important issue that emerges is that all these places in the map that you saw, the location of Thebes, Gopardhan, etc., all this is very close to the areas where there was great amount of economic activity and trade with the Mediterranean world. And on the Italian peninsula, we know for certain that by AD 79, the year in which there was the eruption of Vesuvius, that is the volcano that buried the city of Pompeii and others. So it was, when they excavated, they found this image in a very densely populated area of Pompeii, in a cache of other finely crafted Indian objects. Significantly, the house in which it was found, judging from its architectural plan, could easily have been the house of a wealthy merchant involved in long-distance trade. Now, I want to, so this is the object. So this is the object, and now let's take a look at how one could, evolve this fragment into our larger narrative. Mary Helm's comparative work emphasizes that it was in craft goods rather than in raw materials that the Romans had a vivid sense of, and even an appetite for artifacts produced in distant places like Egypt and India. In the present circumstance of our discussion, it could be pertinent to point out that India emerges as the origin of individual choice. As a rare piece, we know that it was the ivory statue was something that definitely came from the subcontinent, but could not have come from anywhere else. In this sense, such objects of Indian origin added value to it in the Roman eyes of those who had travelled there and wished for that imagery to be taken back home. Thus, Parker suggests that it is erroneous to see India through the lens of commodities, and that the figure acts as a sober reminder of the indivisibility of the imaginary India and the real India. There were intricate cultural meanings attached to such objects. The ivory figurine may just have been taken back for reveling in its aesthetic beauty, an attempt to appreciate an alien land's cultural ethos, unlike cotton and linen and the like, as well as medical and religious uses of spices, aromatics, that was produced, which all had probably a more utilitarian purpose. The reverse may also be true. The reverse was also true. Many craft objects from the Mediterranean have been found on the subcontinent, and these have been subjects of intense investigation, much of which struggles with the issue of whether these goods were imported in their current form, or they were produced locally, or whether they were local objects that were made, and so on. So there are a couple of these objects that have been found of Mediterranean origin at site, like for example at the site of Dharmagiri alone we can attribute a very the statue of this bronze Greco-Roman statue which is sort of clearly could not have been imitated and made over here, but was probably imported. So Arjuna Bhattarai and several other scholars have suggested that in most of these cases, we can merely speculate as to the life histories of individual artifacts, but we need to go down that path so that a possible biography can begin to emerge. Now, much has been written about the maritime trade contact between ancient India and the Mediterranean world. Economic historians of the ancient world have purposely written about the fact that in concrete terms, traders were pretty clear about those objects that came from South Asia, as well as those which ancient people thought to have originated from here. But many of these lists of products found in the Roman records, thus discussed, also included those that came from the Red Sea area. They also included those that came from the Nile Valley, from the Arabian Peninsula, and so on and so forth. They do nonetheless give us an idea of the kind of luxury objects traded to the Roman world. Now, most of the lists of products exported from different parts of India do not, however, include crafted objects of art. So therefore, this ivory statute is a little different and doesn't really fall into this whole discussion of it being an object of trade. There were, however, individual artistic objects that traveled as part of this trade and fascinated people on both sides of this dynamic exchange in the ancient world. We see the beautiful female ivory statue found in Pompeii on the Italian peninsula as one such object, but would argue that it should not be seen as a mere accidental find. It should be seen within the larger story of the unfolding of the Greco-Roman contact across the Indian subcontinent. There were objects that did not necessarily emanate from the more material interests that the merchants from both sides had. In this context, I draw your attention to the phenomena of the intriguing existence of clay imitation Roman coins perfected to the hilt found in many parts of South India and the Deccan. Roman coins minted in India did find their way to India of this period and were used as bullion, and this is well known, signifying some sort of trade exchange in a variety of commodities. But what were these clay imitation coins doing in their midst, alongside them? From the heap of this material transaction, we are compelled to ask non-economic questions of what let the ivory-crafted lady travel all the way to Italy in the first place, and why did people in ancient India have this urge to craft Roman coins? And as you can see from the holes on the top of them, that they were used as decorative purposes. I would argue that even coins which are hardcore evidence indicating trade in substantial terms with the subcontinent turn into craft objects once people at large lay hands on them. Were they dear to them as money or as objects of jewelry used as markers of fashion, or perhaps as objects signifying mystical power? The transformation of coin to craft then is thus both metaphoric as well as real. And to my mind, there are strong reasons to begin to treat them in more than just minimalist fashion, since only then can we broaden the focus of our discourse beyond the mere material and truly highlight more holistically contact between peoples during a period that provides little written description of these objects. Thus, locating and discussing the fragment can inform our meta-narratives that tend to, by definition, ignore the particular, the small, and the unique. These richly crafted figurines are important documentary remains from both sides of the ancient trading world, which have hitherto been only tangentially discussed. They have the potential to understand and discuss both the denotative and the connotative senses of why India has become the site of aspiration and communication beyond the economic on the strength of this kind of object linked to it. So this is the story of the statuette, and now I think that there is a larger in both my fragments. One is like in hardcore sense. One is like the social history meta-narrative. The other is the economic history meta-narrative. And I really think that in both these examples, in ultimate essence, we are dealing with human beings, their desires, their curiosities, their compulsions, their joys. People live in different contexts. They live different embedded lives. They have different. They have ideological and social relations, and they wish to, they wish to do things which maybe perhaps as historians we don't really want to try and find out about, because they don't fit into the larger understanding that we have of what history is. There are, of course, these are examples of just images of things. I had, for the early medieval period, I had done two other studies, and I don't want to spend time on discussing those two other studies because then we won't be able to have any discussion. But one was looking at the images of Chenchu Lakshmi at Ohuvalam. Chenchu Lakshmi is this goddess that is attached to the mythology of Narasimha worship, and the other was where I used the fragment was of fragments of information about Jain women, nuns as well as ordinary women, queens and all, who undertook this Jain ritual of Salinkhana, where the Jain texts actually question whether a woman's body can undertake this Salinkhana, and then in contrast to this meta-narrative of what the Jain texts say, hundreds and hundreds of these Nishidi pillars, maybe I have these. So here's Chenchu Lakshmi. She's not Adi Lakshmi at Ohuvalam, but there are these fragments of information. There is the Quranic meta-narrative also going on in the sculptural art, as you can see on the left. But to my left, there is also Chenchu Lakshmi who is being appeased, who Narasimha is sort of drawing towards himself. But these are, none of the Vastu Shastra texts actually describe the iconography of Chenchu Lakshmi, but we know that this is her because she has the bow and arrow, and also in other, and these are these Nishidi pillars. So these are also fragments. This is for the early medieval period. So it's not just for the ancient period, but people generally tend to think that for the ancient period, lack of information and so on and so forth. It's not the lack of information. It's not that the fragment has to be just supplementing a thing. The question is much deeper. Hopefully, I think, I'm just trying to suggest, and I'll just read the conclusion. Just trying to suggest that shouldn't we be rethinking of the way we do history by placing the fragment into a more central role and looking beyond the conventional scope of what we are intended to do. So our effort in this presentation has been to move beyond existing methodological avenues so as to A, factor in the small and fragmentary into the historical narrative, and B, not reject the textual but read it in the perspective of how the other is represented, and C, stand on the local ground and connect various local entities to create integrated space for the Indian subcontinent. It is well known that writing this past is deeply entwined with the way we perceive and live our present. And so history needs to be positioned as an enabler to retrieve and recover horizontally an expansive, vertically a deeper, and socially a more inclusive past. The fragment enables a rethink and makes history pregnant with potentialities to widen our horizon of the past. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.